The Coke can snapped open and exploded, splashing straight across Madison Cole's shirt like a slap delivered in front of a crowd. The sharp clang of metal hitting the table cut through the air, and in that instant, the entire executive interview room transformed into a ruthless stage, where every pair of eyes locked onto the simplest-looking woman present. Madison stood frozen breath, held tight, her white blouse soaked, and clinging coldly to her skin like an unspoken verdict. Across from her, Aubrey Stanton let out a soft laugh, a smile as sharp as a blade, wrapped in velvet, her blue eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Oops, so sorry," she said, her voice sweet, like honey, laced with poison. And the group of candidates around her shook with stifled laughter, phones lifting, screens flashing with secret recordings. Madison drew a long breath, her fingers tightening around the worn notebook in her hand, the edges frayed the page, trembling beneath her touch as Coke seeped into the paper in blurred brown stains. She said nothing. Not a single protest, not even a frown. Only those deep brown eyes, calm and steady, like a still lake in the middle of a storm of mockery, made a few people jolt before hiding their unease behind another round of laughter. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Summit Vision Media carried the scent of expensive perfume, the click of sharp heels on polished wood, and gazes filled with open judgment. 8 candidates around the table wore suits that served as both armor and declaration, whispering, "I am better than you." They arrived with dazzling resumes, Ivy League degrees, million-dollar campaign portfolios, while Madison, with her worn flats and bare face, looked like someone who had walked onto the wrong floor. Tyler Briggs leaned back, with folded arms, light reflecting off his Versace blazer, until he looked like a walking advertisement. He glanced at Madison, lips curling. Probably a wrong name on the list. Or she is looking for the service room. Laughter rose again, sharp and cutting. Madison heard every word, each one hitting her chest. Yet she held on to her silence. A silence that made people uncomfortable because it did not crack. It did not break. It did not collapse the way they wanted it to. Aubrey looked at Madison as if she were a stain beside her $1,000 shoes. "You could at least bring an iPad or a portfolio," she said, her tone even, but carrying a blade beneath the softness. "A handmade notebook like that is just—" A laugh burst from the far end of the table. Then another, and another. It felt as though the entire room had conspired to suffocate the woman who refused to fight back. Madison took the last empty seat. Her palms damped the chill of her soaked shirt, clinging to her skin like a cruel reminder that they did not want her here. But what they did not know was that she had not come seeking their approval in the first place. In every mind around the table, prideful thoughts shimmered. Aubrey believed she was the top choice because of her family and her long list of high-profile campaigns. Tyler believed he was born for an executive seat. The others believed Madison's presence was part of the scenery, a shadow, a mistake, a detail unworthy of attention. Only Madison sensed the pulse of the room, a rhythm filled with arrogance, prejudice, and ripping gazes. And that feeling did not hurt her. It awakened her. She lifted her eyes, the overhead lights, catching the depth of her dark irises, and for a brief few seconds, the quiet inside her was stronger than the murmurs circling the table. She thought about the long road she had traveled, about the media systems she had built with her own hands through sleepless nights, about the CEO seat that no one in this room knew already belonged to her. Suddenly, the conference room door swung open with a sharp crack. A gust of cold air rushed in. The laughter stopped instantly. Faces paled, and the sound of Samantha Reed's heels cut through the silence, like a warning delivered by fate, coming closer to the moment of revelation none of them saw coming. Madison closed her eyes for a heartbeat, just one breath. The storm was approaching, and this time she would not be the one who bowed her head. Samantha Reed stepped inside her posture, straight her presence cold and sharp like steel forged through decades of holding positions, where a single sentence from her could alter the fate of an entire company. The sound of her heels striking the polished wooden floor echoed with authority, and the room moments ago buzzing with mocking laughter fell into a suffocating silence. Her blade-like gaze swept across the room, cutting through every face, pretending to stay calm. A few forced their smiles back into place, others fumbled with their ties, or hurriedly set their phones beneath the table, as if they had not been laughing at Madison just minutes earlier. But Samantha saw everything. She always saw everything. When her eyes landed on Madison Cole, the damp brown stains still visible on her shirt, the room froze. "Are you all right?" Samantha asked, her voice low, yet powerful enough to pull the entire room back into its proper order. No one breathed. Aubrey Stanton's face flickered, the practiced curve of her lips stiffening instantly. Tyler Briggs looked away, his shoulder twitching as if he wished he could escape the confrontation. Madison nodded, her voice soft but steady. "I am fine." But Samantha did not nod back. Her eyes lingered on the wet mark on Madison's shirt, then on the Coke can rolling beneath the table, then on the face of each candidate sitting around her as if calculating their share of guilt. A silent wave spread across the room, fear rising in its wake. Samantha straightened, set her iPad on the table, and the screen lit up, casting a cool blue glow across her features. Good. Because we are about to begin the most important evaluation of Summit Vision Media this year. The room shifted. A ripple of whispers floated through the air, faint as a breeze skimming across the surface of the table. Some thought she would begin calling them up for interviews. Others assumed she would criticize the behavior they had just displayed. None of them guessed correctly. Samantha turned the iPad, her finger gliding across the screen, and an image appeared on the large projector behind her. In the first second, no one understood what they were looking at. In the second second, a series of soft gasps broke the silence. The image on the screen was Madison. Madison in a sleek black suit. Madison shaking hands with the chairwoman of the board. Madison at the CEO appointment ceremony just 1 week earlier. A voice cracked through the room. "What?" Aubrey stammered, her eyes widening, her usual arrogance draining away. Tyler went rigid, his face paling. Chairs scraped softly as several candidates jerked upright in shock. Samantha spoke one sentence, simple yet thunderous, like a strike of lightning. "Allow me to introduce Madison Cole, the new Chief Executive Officer of Summit Vision Media." No one could speak. The only sound was the pounding heartbeat of someone in the room, or perhaps of everyone at once. Madison sat still, her expression unchanged, but her deep brown eyes held a quiet flame, burning not with anger, but with unwavering resolve. Samantha continued, her voice resonant like a drumbeat. "Today is not the day you are interviewed, the day you are. Today is the day you are observed, and what has just happened is more than enough." Aubrey raised a trembling hand to cover her mouth, her nude, polished nails quivering. She remembered the Coke can snapping open. She remembered her own laughter. Tyler swallowed hard, his whole body shrinking, as the memory of himself mocking Madison replayed like a video he could not stop. The other candidates remembered every sarcastic remark, every condescending glance, every smug smile. And now they understood. They had not insulted an applicant. They had destroyed their own chances in front of the most powerful person in the company. Samantha placed a hand on the table, her voice firm. "You have just shown us your culture, and those who do not fit it will have no place in CEO Cole's team." Silence dropped like a stone. Then every gaze turned toward Madison. But Madison did not look at them. She simply opened her old water-stained notebook, its pages stuck slightly together, yet still readable. Inside were several names. Tyler felt the blood drain from his face. Aubrey's breath caught. The others shivered, because the list had been written long before they knew who she was. And the storm, it seemed, was only beginning. Madison gently turned the page, the wet paper crackling in a sound that tore straight through the tension already choking the room. The overhead lights cast a sharp glow across the thick ink strokes in her notebook, making them appear carved permanent, impossible to erase. No one dared move. Samantha Reed stood still, like a monument of authority arms, folded her cold eyes, observing the room as it unraveled in absolute silence. Madison did not rush to speak. She allowed the quiet to expand, as if giving everyone a moment to confront themselves inside that dark, echoing pause. When she finally raised her head, her gaze swept across each face, not with hatred nor anger, but with the calm certainty of someone who understood human nature far too well. I wrote this list. Before I walked into this room, Madison said, her voice soft, yet full enough to reverberate into every corner. Not a list of people whose skills I wanted to evaluate, but a list of the people whose character I wanted to evaluate. A sharp intake of breath came from the end of the table. Someone dropped a pen, the metallic clatter slicing through the stillness. Madison did not pause. Her finger touched the first line on the page. Aubrey Stanton. The name fell like a hammer, sealing the coffin of everything Aubrey once relied on: her reputation, her network, her polished resume. Aubrey's face twisted her lips, trembling, unable to form a single word. She tried to smile, but her eyes welled with tears, as if her entire world were collapsing beneath her feet. Madison moved to the next line. Tyler Briggs. Tyler gripped his chair so tightly, his knuckles turned pale. His breathing grew unsteady, clinging to whatever pride he could salvage, but failing. Memories of every sarcastic jab he had thrown, every dismissive look he thought harmless, now returned like blades cutting into him. The remaining names needed no announcement. Madison's gaze drifted from face to face, and each person knew exactly where they stood on that list. Madison closed the notebook, the sound echoing like a final verdict. Her voice was calm, almost frighteningly so. I am not dismissing anyone for lacking skill. Skill can be learned. Character cannot. The air in the room vanished. No one dared swallow. No one dared cough. A few candidates lowered their heads, feeling for the first time that morning the true smallness of their own actions. Near the door, the staff member who had brought the Coke for Madison stood, frozen eyes cast downward in shame, realizing that even if she had acted under orders, she had still contributed to the cruelty that had poisoned the entire room. Samantha stepped forward, stopping beside Madison like the second pillar of an unshakable structure. CEO Cole is not here to choose the most talented people, she said, her voice steady sharp, allowing no argument. She is here to choose the most deserving people. The words struck several chests at once. Some tightened their grip on their chairs, as if holding on to the last remnants of their crumbling confidence. Madison's eyes moved from face to face, revealing greed, arrogance, deceit, complacency, all laid bare without a shield. Then she lifted her gaze to the large screen behind her, where her appointment ceremony continued to shine like a warning bell, for anyone who had forgotten that the world is not built on surface glamour, but on the true worth of those who work silently beneath it. I came here to test you, Madison said, and you have answered. One short sentence, but it shattered every wall each person had built around themselves. Aubrey broke down in tears. Tyler bowed his head so low it nearly touched the table. The others sat in stunned quiet, as if watching their own reflections, stripped of every excuse. Madison rose, adjusting the collar of her shirt, still marked with the sticky sweetness of coke. She could smell the sugar clinging to the fabric, cold and unpleasant. But none of it mattered anymore. Because true power does not come from the outfit you wear or the shine you project. It comes from the strength to stand tall after being humiliated. As she walked away, each step sounded like a warning, a reminder that this was no longer a playground for those who judged others by appearances. This was a place where truth was laid bare, sharp and unforgiving. And Madison was the one holding the blade. The room sank into a heavy, suffocating silence, not the silence of respect, but the silence born from the terror of being exposed. Madison stood at the center of the storm, her slender frame carrying an aura as sharp as steel hidden beneath silk. She set the notebook on the table, her fingers still sticky with traces of coke. Yet her movements remained fluid and composed, making the panic on the faces across from her look even more pitiful. The cold white lights illuminated her face, bringing out the depth in her dark brown eyes holding a level of understanding, far beyond her 34 years, an understanding forged through years spent behind the curtain of this media empire, watching everything that others chose to ignore. Samantha Reed still stood beside her chin, slightly raised, carrying the presence of a battle-hardened general who had seen far too many wars and never lost one. Her arms were folded, her gaze sweeping the room, as if waiting to see who dared speak first. No one did. The expensive chairs suddenly felt confining, and the people sitting in them felt bound by their own arrogance. Tyler Briggs broke the silence first, though, with a trembling voice he could not control. I did not know." He swallowed lips pale. "I did not know you were the chief executive officer." Madison looked at him, not with anger, yet not with softness either. It was the look a doctor gives a patient trying to hide an illness. Not angry, just disappointed. "So, if I were an actual applicant," Madison asked, her voice low, but sharp as a blade, "you believe treating me that way would be acceptable?" Tyler opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The words he once wielded, so confidently polished and sharpened by his pride in his designer blazer, now turned into a stone lodged in his throat. Aubrey Stanton gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. She tried to summon a gentle smile, desperate to cling to the polished image she had crafted. "Madison, I mean..." But Madison interrupted her softly. "You laughed when someone was humiliated. You recorded it. You judged my worth by my clothes and my notebook." Each word dropped like a drumbeat, slow and heavy and impossible to avoid. "I do not need your explanation," Madison said, her voice closing, the last remaining door. The room froze at those words, because they did not carry forgiveness. They carried the message that the game was over, and they had lost. Another candidate, who had remained silent the entire time, hoping to stay invisible, finally spoke. "We just thought you were in the wrong room." Madison turned toward them, her gaze sharp enough to make the person bow their head immediately. "And that is the problem," she said. "You are too quick to assume, too quick to judge, and too confident that your assumptions are correct." Samantha nodded slightly, agreeing with every word Madison spoke. She continued in a tone that made the entire room tremble. "We did not build a multi-billion-dollar company on carelessness. We do not hand leadership to those who cannot see value in a human being beyond the clothes they wear." A tiny sob escaped from Aubrey. Tyler lowered his head, clasping his hands together, trying to contain the humiliation swelling inside his chest. Near the door, the staff member who had brought the coke finally whispered, his voice small, as if afraid his breath alone might shatter the air. "I am sorry, ma'am." Madison turned to him. He was perhaps the only person in the room who had not tried to prove anything, who had not wrapped himself in arrogance. His eyes held genuine remorse, not fear of losing an opportunity. Madison gave a faint nod, saying nothing yet. That nod alone eased the trembling in the young employee's heart. A candidate at the far end of the table broke into tears, the choked sob held back for too long. The tears triggered a wave of shame through the room, as if every person were seeing their true self under an unforgiving light. Samantha straightened and delivered the final verdict. This is not an interview. This is a culture test. And unfortunately, she swept her gaze across each face. Most of you have failed. A soft murmur escaped from several corners of the room. Madison lifted her notebook, holding it to her chest. She took a step forward, her voice low yet gentle. I am not looking for perfect people. I am looking for people who know how to respect others. The sentence fell like the final blade, severing every illusion left in the room. And in that moment, everyone realized they did not fail because Madison was the chief executive officer. They failed because of who they were. The air in the conference room seemed to freeze after Madison's final words, as if someone had slammed a door shut, and all the light had been swallowed whole. The faces once full of pride and confidence were now twisted under the weight of a truth they could no longer outrun. Tyler bent forward, his large frame collapsing in on itself, like a child caught doing something unforgivable. His hands clasped so tightly the veins stood out along the backs of them. Every echo of laughter in his mind felt like a hooked blade tearing apart what little dignity he had left. Aubrey Stanton's breathing grew shallow, her trembling hand pressed against her chest, as if trying to steady a heart that had begun to spiral out of control. Never in her life, after years of being pampered and shielded by privilege, had she imagined her polished, glittering facade could shatter so violently in mere minutes, all because she had revealed her true nature, before someone she never realized held the fate of this interview in her hands. The other candidates began avoiding each other's eyes, as if even a glance could expose the pretenses they had worked so hard to maintain. A few muttered clumsy apologies not addressed to anyone in particular, but spoken out of pure fear of being discarded. Yet Madison remained still calm, like a glassy lake before a storm showing neither anger nor satisfaction at their collapse. She simply watched, her deep eyes steady, as if she had already foreseen everything unfolding exactly as it was. Samantha Reed was different. She walked slowly along the length of the table, her gaze dissecting every detail. A dropped pen, a bent folder, a trembling hand pressed flat against wood. I want you to understand this, Samantha said, her voice sharp enough to slice through the silence. Leadership positions are not for people who lose control of themselves when facing someone they believe is beneath them. The atmosphere trembled. Madison glanced at Samantha, then stepped back, allowing her to continue leading the most revealing moment Summit Vision Media had ever witnessed. This company survives. Samantha continued, not because of those who perform well when they know they are being watched, but because of those who keep their integrity even when they think no one is looking. Aubrey blinked rapidly as tears spilled down her cheeks, one drop falling onto the edge of the table, small and round, yet sounding like thunder inside her mind. Tyler opened his mouth to speak, but Madison's eyes made the words die before they formed. Another candidate, the young man who had laughed when the Coke spilled, suddenly pushed his chair back and stood. But his legs shook so badly he had to brace himself with both hands. I am so sorry, he said hoarsely, eyes reddened. He bowed deeply, hair falling forward to hide his face. I behaved terribly. I am not that kind of person. Madison watched him for a long moment. Her gaze did not seek to wound him, but it offered no escape either. You are that person, she said softly, at least today. The words were gentle as a breeze, yet they carried enough force to make anyone collapse. because Madison was not denying their ability to change. She simply refused to let them run from the truth. The conference room door creaked open as a technician stepped in to check the equipment, but he immediately closed it again when he sensed the tension inside tight enough to snap. Madison turned toward the screen, where her image from the CEO appointment ceremony still glowed brightly. She remembered that moment when senior leaders, those who understood her true value, shook her hand and congratulated her. They knew she did not need a spotlight. She only needed to do the work. The contrast with this room was stark, filled with people who wanted nothing more than to wear a shiny version of themselves, long enough to catch management's attention. I used to think Madison said her voice soft yet resonant, that once you reach the top, the hardest part is making the right decisions. But today, I realize sometimes the hardest part is seeing who people really are in the smallest of moments. A long silence followed. No one dared breathe. And that moment, Madison looked directly at each of them. Was when you believed I was nobody. Each word pierced like a needle, not painful in volume, but so precise that no one could avoid it. It was the moment the candidates understood they had not just lost a career opportunity, they had lost the better version of themselves they could have been. A cold draft from the air conditioner swept through the room, thickening the atmosphere even further, as if the luxurious conference space were slowly transforming into an invisible courtroom, where every word and every glance from Madison became an inescapable indictment. The candidates sat in their chairs, yet felt as though they were standing on the edge of a cliff, needing only the slightest nudge to plunge into a bottomless fall. Madison stepped forward into a wider arc of light, her shadow stretching across the polished wooden table, soft yet commanding. She did not point fingers. She did not raise her voice, but it was her calm expression that made everyone feel the brutal distance between the person they were and the person they pretended to be. When I walked into this room, Madison said, her voice steady, gentle but deep, "You did not know my name. You did not know my past. You did not know the position I hold. And you assumed that meant I was beneath you." A few people lifted their heads on instinct, only to immediately lower them again when they met Madison's gaze. A gaze without anger, but with a clarity that forced each of them to see the ugliest version of themselves. "You were not wrong," Madison continued, and the room flinched at the unexpected shift, "for not knowing who I am." Another beat of silence. "But you were wrong," she added softly, "to believe that gave you the right to treat me the way you did." Tyler felt his whole body turn cold. He remembered the way he leaned back in his chair, smirking at her simple clothing, the condescending glance, the careless insult. Every memory now felt like a serrated blade, slicing into what remained of his damaged pride. Aubrey trembled, trying to breathe deeply, but finding her chest tightening instead. She had grown up in a world where appearance and status were a form of currency, where glamour walked ahead of every introduction. But no one had ever examined her under the light of character. Today, this room did. Madison turned to Samantha, as if drawing strength from the one woman who understood the entire journey behind her rise. Samantha gave a slight nod, then spoke in a voice so sharp, even the documents on the table seemed to quiver. "This selection process is not only looking for talent, it is looking for leaders." The words spun in the minds of the candidates. Leadership was not about a sharp suit-polished speech or impressive projects. Leadership was about how a person treated the one they believed was the smallest in the room. And by that measure, they had all failed. Madison looked again at the open folder before her, the glossy resumes filled with accomplishments that now meant nothing compared to what had just unfolded. "There are two things," she said, her voice lower and firmer, "that a leader must never lose respect for others and integrity within themselves." The room remained utterly silent, as each word fell like a steady needle into the air. I have worked with many departments in this company, Madison continued, and I have met people with no prestigious degrees, but full of kindness. I have also met people with great talent who lost themselves because they believed they stood above others. Her eyes swept the room. Today, you have shown me clearly which group you belong to. A few people broke into tears, unable to contain the humiliation, rising like a tidal wave, washing away every glamorous layer they once wrapped themselves in. But Madison was not finished, because the core of this truth lay even deeper. You thought I came here to observe your skills, she said, her voice soft, yet carrying across the room. But what I really wanted to observe was the kind of environment you would create. Confusion flickered across several faces. You created a toxic environment, Madison said plainly. An environment where cruelty is celebrated, where laughter matters more than compassion, where someone who looks a little different is dismissed without hesitation. The room tightened, as though every wall were closing in. If you were to become leaders, Madison asked, would others have to work in an environment like that? No one answered. No one dared, because they knew the answer. They knew it was terrifying, and they knew they were the cause of it. Samantha broke the silence with a slow inhale. Then an exhale, her gaze sharp as a signature on a verdict. The truth, she said, is something not everyone has the courage to face. Madison nodded gently, and in that moment she was no longer the woman who had Coke spilled on her. She was a mirror reflecting the truth, and no one in that room liked the reflection staring back at them. Madison walked slowly toward the head of the table, each step landing on the wooden floor like a steady drumbeat, awakening the truth everyone in the room had tried desperately to avoid. She placed both hands on the table, leaning slightly forward, not in threat, but with a presence powerful enough to make even the most arrogant individuals lower their gaze. I want you to think back, Madison said, her voice low calm, yet carrying undeniable force, to the very first moment I walked into this room. A heavy silence stretched, pale faces, reddened eyes, clenched hands, all of them being dragged back to a moment they once believed was insignificant. In that moment, Madison continued in just a few short seconds. You made your conclusions about me. She looked directly at Aubrey, about my worth, then at Tyler, about my place. And finally, she swept her gaze across the rest, about my right to be treated with respect. Tyler bowed his head, chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, as whatever remained of his pride crumbled inside him. Aubrey covered her mouth, tears spilling uncontrollably, her shoulders trembling, as if she were finally seeing a version of herself she had spent her whole life avoiding. The others tried to maintain what little composure they had left, but their eyes darted away from one another, unable to bear the shared truth that this entire room had become a living monument to a different kind of poison prejudice. What is prejudice? Madison asked, not waiting for an answer. It is the moment you choose to look at someone's clothes, their shoes, their bag, instead of looking at the person. She paused for a breath, her voice dropping. And in that moment, you revealed who you are. Samantha stood beside her, eyes sharp, as though engraving every word onto the walls of the conference room. Her arms were crossed, the faint curve of her lips suggesting she had waited a long time to witness a generation of entitled candidates stripped of the armor they thought could never be pierced. At Summit Vision Media, Samantha said, picking up where Madison left off, "We do not want people who behave well only when they know they are being watched." She paused, her gaze locking onto a trembling candidate at the far end of the table. "We want people who remain kind even when they believe no one is watching." A quiet sob broke from a young woman. She wiped her tears, feeling a burning sting in her chest, as every excuse she could have used to protect herself fell apart. Madison stepped back into the center of the room, the light catching her face like a spotlight of unfiltered truth. Do you know, she said slowly, why I came here? In simple clothes, carrying an old notebook, wearing no makeup. A few heads lifted confused, as if they were about to hear the answer to a test they never realized they were taking. Madison gently placed a hand over her chest. Because I wanted to see how you would treat someone you thought could offer you nothing. A cold wave swept across the room, as though someone had opened a door straight into the heart of an unforgiving truth. And I saw it. No one dared breathe. I saw arrogance. Madison said, her voice harder now. Disrespect. Her eyes locked onto Tyler. Mockery. Then she turned to Aubrey. Cruelty, disguised as a smile. Finally, she looked across the others. And I also saw a few good things, though very few. The young staff member, standing near the door, lowered his head even further. Shame coloring his face, yet a faint glimmer of gratitude softened his eyes when Madison offered him a quiet nod. That single gesture straightened his posture, as though she had handed him a shred of dignity he feared he had lost. A leader, Madison said, her voice ringing like a metal bell, is not the person with the best seat, not the person in the most expensive clothes, not the person with the flashiest resume. She rested her hand on the old notebook. A leader is the one who makes others feel safe enough that they do not need to defend themselves. Samantha nodded slowly, her expression filled with absolute approval. And today, Madison continued, you have shown me exactly who in this room makes others shrink out of fear. Several people broke into tears. Others bowed their heads so low their foreheads nearly touched the table, and a few, for the first time in their lives, looked directly at their own flaws without turning away. There are lessons, Madison said softly, that you only learn when you fail. Her eyes softened, not sharp now, but misted like a thin layer of fog settling over a freshly opened wound. And today, that failure is the only opportunity you have to look at yourselves again. No one protested. No one excused themselves. No one dared. Because now they knew Madison was not just the chief executive officer. She was the one holding the mirror. And they were being forced to look into it, seeing clearly everything they had always avoided. At that moment, the conference room door trembled softly. A gentle knock echoed from the hallway, but no one turned to look. Because everyone in the room was already facing a sound far louder, the collapse of the versions of themselves they once believed were unshakable. The conference room door shuddered a second time, as if reminding everyone that the world outside still existed, while inside this room time had stretched so thin it was nearly motionless. But no one turned. Everyone remained trapped within themselves, caught between the collapse of their own ego and the awakening of truth. Madison swept her gaze across the room, her eyes moving slowly over each face as if she were touching every layer of defense that had just fallen apart. The light from the window behind her cast a soft halo around her slender yet unshakably steady frame, a gentle glow that contrasted sharply with the icy tension gripping the room. What I want to tell you, Madison began, her voice smooth yet resonant, like a taut string struck in the quiet, is not only about the mistakes you made. Some candidates lifted their heads reflexively, then instantly lowered them again, unsure whether what came next would be salvation or simply another blow. What matters more? Madison continued, is who you became in the moment you believed you did not need to try. Tyler clutched the edge of his chair, heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his own ears. He realized he had not just failed an interview. He had failed the test of his own character. Aubrey wiped her tears again and again, but they refused to stop. She had always believed that a perfect appearance, confidence, and privileged background could open every door. Yet today, the only door that truly mattered had slammed shut in her face, not because she lacked talent, but because she lacked heart. Madison stepped closer to the large screen where her CEO appointment ceremony was still displayed, glowing like a quiet reminder that her power did not begin today. It was the result of years of unseen dedication. "I want to tell you something," she said, resting her hand on the edge of the table, as if anchoring a distant memory. "When I was a young engineer here, no one knew my name. I wore inexpensive clothes, carried an old laptop, moved from floor to floor, and no one noticed. The room swallowed every word. There were days," Madison continued, "when I stood by the coffee machine and listened to people say that someone like me would never achieve anything great." She smiled, not with arrogance, but with the quiet strength of someone who survived. "But I did not get angry," she said. "I simply remembered." Samantha stood behind her eyes, softening as if witnessing something sacred. "What I learned," Madison said, her voice deepening, "is that a truly kind person never needs to know who is watching, because they always act the right way, even when they think no one is. Many people cried again, not from humiliation this time, but because they realized that perhaps for years they had been walking the wrong path, striving to prove they were talented instead of proving they were good." Today's evaluation. Samantha added her tone sharp, but no longer harsh, was designed to see how you react in an imperfect moment. She looked at each person in turn, recalling the Coke can bursting and everything that followed, and you reacted not with support, but with ridicule. A heavy silence rippled through the room. Madison returned to the center, her eyes filled with unwavering resolve, but also compassion. "I am not saying this to diminish you," she said softly, "but to help you understand that if you want to be worthy of leadership, you must begin by leading yourselves." Samantha nodded and stepped beside her, their presence forming a single unified force. "And the very first step of leadership," she said, "is the courage to face your mistakes." Hands tightened beneath the table. A few sniffled. Others sat still, but their eyes had changed, no longer cold or detached, but heavy with awareness. Madison looked at them for a long moment. "I believe," she said gently, "that every person here has the ability to become a better version of themselves." She drew in a slow breath, releasing the disappointment she had carried since walking into the room. "But that begins only," her gaze sharpened, "when you stop seeing others as beneath you." The conference room door trembled again. This time, it was not a knock, but simply someone passing by in the hallway. Yet no one inside the room noticed, because they all understood now that the moment unfolding here was not just the lesson of an interview. It was a turning point, a moment where masks fell, where harsh but necessary truth opened a new path. And each of them, whether they wished to or not, had already taken their first step onto it. The moment Madison stepped back, her shoulders relaxing, the air in the room seemed to lose its gravity. Samantha Reed scanned the space, her sharp eyes capturing every expression: shame, collapse, remorse, and the stunned bewilderment of people who were for the first time realizing that power did not live in degrees, reputation, or appearance, but in the smallest moments of kindness. "This meeting ends here," Samantha declared, her voice low and firm, like a judge's gavel striking wood. "You will receive an email today. For many of you, this may be the end, but for a select few, perhaps, this is only the beginning." The words made the entire room look up, fear and hope tangling together, yet no one knew which group they belonged to. Samantha tilted her head toward Madison, as if passing her the final piece of what belonged to her. Madison took a deep breath and spoke, her voice soft but tight, like a strand of steel. "I will review every attitude, every action, every reaction from each person in this room. Not just today, but throughout your entire application process and every exchange you have made. But the heaviest weight She looked directly at the trembling Aubrey. Lies in how you chose to treat another human being when you believed you did not need them. Tyler swallowed hard, choking back a sob. A candidate at the far end of the table buried their face in their hands, shoulders shaking. The staff member near the door bowed once more, but this time his eyes held not just shame, but gratitude, because Madison had proved that kindness was never meaningless. Madison took one slow step back, her voice lowering, like the closing of a final chapter. I am not asking you to be perfect. I am asking you to wake up. Those words fell softly like silk, yet weighed on every chest like stone. No one responded. No one could. They looked at her with a mixture of awe, fear, and the faint hope that perhaps somehow they could still be forgiven even just a little. Madison turned toward the door, walking with a calmness that only intensified the ache inside those watching her leave. To them, it felt like a door of power, closing and locking from the inside. When her hand touched the doorknob, the entire room held its breath. No one called out to her. No one dared. She opened the door and stepped into the brightly lit hallway, the world outside starkly different from the heavy air behind her. Samantha followed her, without a word, without looking back. The door eased shut, releasing a quiet click. But to those inside, it sounded like metal sealing their fate. When the door fully closed, the silence in the room became a shadow hovering over every person. No more Madison's gaze. No more Samantha's razor-edged voice. Only themselves and what they had done. Aubrey collapsed into her chair, covering her face shoulders, shaking in despair. Tyler stared at the glass wall before him, seeing his reflection for the first time not as the confident, superior man he always presented, but as someone suddenly lost. Several candidates were too weak in the knees to stand. Many avoided looking at one another, knowing each of them had contributed to the cruelty of that first moment. No more laughter, no more smugness, no more polished facades. Only truth, bare heavy and impossible to erase. And that was the moment everyone in that room understood that sometimes doors close not to end an opportunity, but to force you to confront the person you chose to become. And if they had enough courage, this would be the first moment they truly began to change. Madison walked down the long, glass-lined hallway, where the lights reflected across her face, with an almost serene glow, as if she had not just left behind a room full of candidates, but a lesson they would carry for the rest of their professional lives. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside, her arms gently holding the old notebook, still marked with water stains, a perfect symbol of the test she had intentionally created. The elevator doors closed, cutting her off from the heavy breaths lingering behind the conference room door. And in that moment, Madison was not thinking about the cruelty they had shown her, nor the authority she had just displayed. She thought of the most important truth, that kindness still held value, even in a world that often dismissed it first. The elevator stopped on the 50th floor, and the CEO's office opened before her, a space completely different, quiet, bright, untouched by judgment. She placed the notebook on her desk, took a deep breath, and looked out the massive window where the city stretched beneath her like a map of endless opportunities. Down there, millions of people were fighting for a position, a step forward, a better life. And Madison understood that her role was not only to lead, but to build an environment where anyone could be themselves without fear of being diminished for their appearance or their past. Inside the 50th floor office, the gentle light cast a soft glow across Madison's face, and she smiled, not the smile of victory, not the smile of retaliation, but the smile of someone who knew she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. And from that moment on, Summit Vision Media began to change not because of a CEO's mandate, but because of the heart of a person who understood that true value is quiet, but never weak. From the perspective of an expert in organizational culture and human behavior, Madison's story reminds us of a truth that never grows old. Skill may take you far, but character is what determines where you truly stand in the long journey ahead. Power can change the way many people behave, yet it is the smallest moments, the unguarded reactions, that reveal a person's true nature most clearly. A healthy environment is not built on elegant words, but on the respect shown to every individual, even when they do not look like the so-called ideal candidate in someone else's eyes. If this story resonates with you, tap like to help spread the message of kindness, and subscribe so you do not miss the next inspiring journeys of awakening. Before you go, leave a comment with the phrase Ton Trong as a reminder that the path to becoming a better version of ourselves always begins with how we treat the person beside us.